The question of Ukraine's NATO membership may have been the main focus of the summit in Vilnius, but on the sidelines, there was a fair bit of engagement between NATO and Indo-Pacific nations. Australia, Japan, New Zealand and South Korea were meeting an organization that has historically always been transatlantic. Only now it appears to want to be Indo-Pacific as well. The four nations mentioned aren't NATO members, but partner countries. And it's a partnership that's being redefined in a time of war.
In the current severe international security environment, the security of Europe and the Indo-Pacific are inseparable. Japan and NATO share the understanding that unilateral attempts to change the status quo by force will not be tolerated, regardless of where in the world, and share the understanding of the importance of maintaining and strengthening a free and open international order based on the rule of law. It follows that Japan and NATO, which share fundamental values and strategic interests, are further deepening our ties.
And joining me now for more is Garima Mohan. She's a senior fellow in the Indo-Pacific program at the GMF think tank and an expert in Europe's ties with the Indo-Pacific. Garima, what is driving NATO interest in the Indo-Pacific?
Great to be back on your show, Biresh. I think it's important to note that NATO's interest in the Indo-Pacific is not new. We already started looking at mentions of Indo-Pacific a few years ago in NATO documents, much before Ukraine. And the key reason for this interest was, of course, China. China's increasing influence in Europe, and NATO, as well as other organizations, started looking at the implications of that. Incidents of political influence, economic intimidation, the direct and indirect security threats which come from China's investment in critical infrastructure in Europe. All of these things started driving NATO to look at the Indo-Pacific and talk to countries in the region who might be facing similar threats vis-a-vis China. I would like to note that NATO has had global partners for a long time, including Japan, South Korea, Australia. These countries were also crucial in providing support for Ukraine. And increasingly, NATO has also been interested in engaging India. Secretary General Stoltenberg spoke at the Raisina Dialogue in India. NATO officials have started meeting with Indian officials, both to understand the big security threat from China on the Indian border, but also to understand India's relationship with Russia. So all around, quite a few factors driving NATO's interest in this key region.
So this engagement, what is the kind of engagement we are talking about? Are we talking about security cooperation, NATO troops in the Indo-Pacific? What form of engagement will this eventually turn out to be?
That is the million-dollar question. For now, NATO's engagement in the region is pretty much coordination, trying to understand the experiences of these countries in the Indo-Pacific, trying to understand how security challenges in the Indo-Pacific can have an impact on Europe. The two theaters are connected, European and Indo-Pacific regions are connected. And the most important example of that is Russia-China coordination and alignment that we have seen emerge in even before Ukraine, but really became a crucial security concern for NATO and other members after Ukraine. So I think that is an important connection that NATO is making by engaging with the Indo-Pacific. What form this engagement will take going forward? Will that stay at the coordination level, or does it mean NATO presence in the region? That is still an open question. There was talks of creating a NATO office in Japan, which were vetoed by Paris. I think it's important to look at what countries in the region want, what do Asian countries want, and there you would have varied responses. Some would say, why not? More NATO means more hands on deck when it comes to dealing with, for example, Taiwan contingency, China's aggressive behavior in the region, why not? But a number of other countries would have questions as to why should NATO engage in a far-off region, and would it not be more important if it was focused on guaranteeing European security first?
China had also something to say about the recent summit, the NATO summit in Vilnius. It said, and I quote, "It resolutely opposes NATO's eastward movement into the Asia-Pacific region." Is there a danger here, Garima, that NATO engagement in the region further destabilizes it?
I think that would be an exaggeration. I think Chinese reactions to any sort of statements are like that these days. We see a lot of grandstanding from China. I think if an actor is destabilizing the Indo-Pacific right now, it is China and not NATO. NATO's engagement has been very surface level. And I think the coordination between European countries and Indo-Pacific countries when dealing with similar challenges from Russia and China is just inevitable. So I don't think any one country can have a veto on how other actors engage with its region. And I don't think in the future there's any real possibility of a massive NATO engagement, troops on the ground in the Indo-Pacific. So we have to be a little balanced in how we look at this.
Just on the subject of coordination within Europe and within NATO, just to go back to the point you raised earlier about France opposing the opening of a NATO liaison office in Japan, why is France against this?
I think the broader point of NATO engagement, I think we have to look at how there's a crucial lesson being learned in Europe that the experiences of dealing with an authoritarian Russia will be similar to those of China. And Europe shouldn't make the same mistake of being over-dependent on China in critical sectors as it was on Russia. So I think on that argument, European countries are on the same level. But when it comes to their China policies, they're still being defined. As we saw when President Macron went to Beijing, he took a very different tone from what Ms. von der Leyen has said about the China challenge. And therefore, I think European countries are still trying to figure out what exactly is their relationship with China. How much do they want to push? And therefore, some are more cautious than others. I mean, today we are expecting to see the China strategy in Germany. That would also, lead to some clarifications. But I think it remains to be seen where the chips will fall on European China policies and China approaches. Until that time, we would see these different reactions. Countries like France sometimes being a bit more cautious. At other times, they're not. For example, when sending French frigates through the Indo-Pacific, they're quite forward-leaning.
We'll leave it there for the time being, but thanks so much for joining us again. Garima Mohan from the GMF.
Thank you for having me.